Hello students, welcome again. Students, in today's video lecture, we are going to study how to study poetry. William Henry Hudson has discussed this topic in chapter number 3, where he talks about the appreciation of poetry. Okay, now the basic question is what this appreciation of poetry is. Remember that appreciation of poetry, it includes the attempt your attempt to understand, to analyze, or to evaluate a work of art written by a poet. Okay, when the poet writes a poem and when the reader reads that poem, it is important that as the students of literature, as the reader, as the scholar, or as the critique of literature, we need to understand and analyze the whole poem in a very systematic manner. That process of understanding, evaluating that poem is known as the appreciation of a poem. It is just like a human body which has been dissected by the doctors. Okay, see, our human body is made of different parts, different organs. Okay, and what is the role and function of each organ in the human body? To understand that, what does the doctor do? The doctor does a kind of dissection, and he literally has a look at different parts of the body, different organs of the body, and then he does the analysis of each and every part or organ of the body. In the same manner, a critique of literature or a critique of poetry, he tries to have a look at different aspects of poetry writing. It includes, he examines the words, the lines, the stanzas, the thoughts, different poetic devices, figures of speech, and everything, and ultimately takes the judgment whether a poem is interesting or not, whether a poem is a great poem or not. So, what points or what organs do we examine while doing the appreciation of a poem? That you can see on the screen, it includes so many things. Number one, the poet's lives and works. Number two, the title, summary, theme, what kind of poem, what type of poem it is. Okay, the composition of the poem, rhyme and meter, figures of speech, and all such things. So now let's have a look at all these different organs which make a poem, right? Number one, initially we should begin with knowing who the poet is. We must gather some information, some basic information about the life of the poet, about the major works, major important works written by that poet. Okay, so in the beginning, the reader has to find out these details. Why? Because a poet is actually the product of the times during which he lived. He is also the product of the social environment in which he was brought up. Okay, so what kind of education he received, what were his ideals, what were his what was the social environment, what was his culture. All these basic details, biographical details, are important for a reader to see when you are appreciating poetry, right? So that is important. We need to find out the major important works also. Say for example, if you are analyzing a poem written by John Donne, okay, so find out during which times he was living, what was the culture, what kind of education he received, and what kind of poetry he has mostly written. Number two, the title of the poem. You have read the books, right? So the books begin with the index. What is the importance of index? When you read the index, you get the basic idea of what chapters are presented in that book. In the same manner, the title is important. When we read the title, as a reader, you need to understand the meaning of the title. Why? Because mostly the poets choose the best possible title which expresses the central idea of the poem. So the title itself tells us a lot many things about the poem. So that is the second point. Third is to summarize the whole poem. We know that the whole poem is written in different stanzas, right? It may be written in couplets, tercets, quatrains, and so on. So count how many stanzas are there. Beginning from the first stanza, we need to read the lines of each stanza and see how the poet introduces the main subject matter, the theme of the poem, how in the later stanza, second, third, fourth, fifth stanza, how the poet develops that idea, and how in the last stanza the poet concludes the topic. Okay, so line by line, stanza wise, you have to summarize the poem. So you can write something what the poet has presented in lines in the form of poetry, you should present in the form of your own prose language. Okay, the most important thing is the theme of the poem, which is also known as the thesis. Okay, thesis means the central idea, the central serious thought which is presented in the poem. Remember, friends, that no work of art, no poetry can exist without the central idea, without the thesis of the poem. So, what is that serious idea which the poet wants to convey by writing this poem? You need to find out that, and then you need to relate it with your own life, with the life of the people. Why? Because great poetry is one in which the poet expresses some universal ideas, right? Say, for example, when you read Wordsworth's poem Daffodils, okay, there he has presented the idea of loneliness in the beginning, and then towards the end of the poem, we understand that the basic idea presented loneliness turns into happiness because of the presence of nature in the poet's life. So, how nature makes us happy, how nature brings happiness in our life, that is the serious idea presented in the poem. So, in every poem, we need to find out that particular serious thought presented by the poet. Another important feature, another important aspect that we need to examine while appreciating the poem is the type of the poem. You need to decide which kind of poem the poet has written. Okay, see, there are different types of poems. In my previous videos, I have already discussed that. Okay, there is a poem, maybe a personal poem, it can be an impersonal poem, subjective and objective poem. Okay, sometimes some poets might feel comfortable writing a lyric poem, some other poets might be interested in writing an epic poem. Okay, sometimes the poet adopts a kind of narrative style of writing poem. Some other poets like reflective style. So reflective poetry, narrative poetry, epic poetry, dramatic poetry, lyric poetry, these are different types of poetry. So while doing the appreciation of poetry, you need to decide which kind of poetry this one is. Okay, the next important topic is composition of the poem. Composition means structure. What is the structure of the poem? We know that the poet writes in the form of stanzas. Okay, the prose writer like novelists, like essayists, they write their literature in the form of paragraphs, but the poets write in the form of stanzas. So you need to count how many stanzas are there and which kind of stanzas are used by the poets. There are, in one of my previous videos, rhyme and meter, versification, there I have discussed these different types of stanzas, like couplets means a stanza of 2 lines, tercets stanza of 3 lines, quatrains a stanza of 4 lines, quatrains a stanza of 5 lines, sestets a stanza of 6 lines, rhyme royal a stanza of 7 lines, octaves a stanza of 8 lines. These are different types of stanzas. So you need to count how many lines are there in the poem, how these lines are divided into different stanzas. Then you need to count how many stanzas are there in the poem. So what is the structure of the whole poem, and what method has been used by the poet, that you need to examine. Okay, another important thing is the use of rhyme and meter. When we do the appreciation or analysis of the poem, we need to find out which kind of rhyming scheme is used by the poet. How do we come to know about the rhyming scheme of the poem? You see the last words of each line, they rhyme with each other, they rhyme with one another. Say for example, the last word of the first line is go, and the last word of the second line is so go and so, they look similar while speaking. Okay, so that is called rhyming. So find out which rhyming scheme is used by the poet. Say for example, the poet has written a stanza of 4 lines, a quatrain. It can have a rhyming scheme like A B A B. So the first and the third line rhyme with each other. Okay, there can be a rhyming scheme A B B A, in which the first and the fourth one are similar, second and the third one are similar. Okay, there can be a rhyming scheme AABB. So there are different kinds of rhyming schemes found in each stanza, so that we need to find out. Also, another important thing is find out the meter, which kind of meter is used by the poet. There are 4 basic meters in English poetry: iambus, trochee, anapist and dactyl. Iambus has a rising rhythm. Okay, trochee has a falling rhythm, anapist has a rising rhythm, dactyl has a falling rhythm. What are these iambus, trochee, anapist and dactyl? That I have already discussed in my previous video, which is entitled as versification in poetry. So if you want to go into that detail, you can watch that video. Okay, so find out which meter is used, whether it is iambic tetrameter, whether it is iambic pentameter, whether it is iambic hexameter, or what kind of meter is used. So that you need to analyze. And the last point is the use of figures of speech by the poet. You see, what is the basic difference between a common man's language and the poet's language? The basic difference is the use of rhyme and meter, number one, and number two, the use of figures of speech. Figures of speech make your language flowery language, make your language literary or more beautiful language. Just like a woman who uses various ornaments. Why does she use these ornaments? To look more beautiful. In the same manner, every poet also uses some literary ornaments of language, which are known as figures of speech, to make his poetry more effective, more interesting, and more alarming. Okay, so sometimes some very serious, complex, or philosophical thoughts are presented by the poet, which he finds very difficult to express using common language, simple language. So instead of that, he uses some figures of speech, some ornaments of language, like simile, metaphor, like hyperbole, like alliteration, assonance. Okay, these figures of speech, they will make the poet able to express the ideas effectively and more beautifully. So these are the 8 points which you need to examine while doing the analysis of the poem, while doing the appreciation of the poem. I hope now the idea is clear, and if you still have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel, and please do share this video among all your classmates so that others can also be benefited. Thank you very much.